Star Trek Deep Space Nine Field Trip. Chapter 3. Ashley and even Tara seemed to be just as excited about the field trip as Jake and Nog. The four of them were thrilled to be getting out for a week on an alien world and to actually go through the wormhole. The only problem was that the next few days seemed to take forever to pass. Jake found it difficult to concentrate on his lessons, with the thought of the trip always present in his mind. 6 of the Bajoran students were going with him. Marn Laren was their unofficial leader since she was both 2 years older than the others and also by nature somewhat bossy. Jake and the others got along well enough with her, but they weren't part of that circle. The other 5 Bajorans were Taryn Bacchus, Bren Sainer, Chel Boras, all boys, Rakt Lauren, and Pahat Kalin, 2 more girls. Jake knew them all from school, but they were all under 10 and too young to include in his normal activities. Ms. O'Brien had arranged for a substitute teacher to take on the 4 other students that weren't going along on the field trip. 2 of them were too young, and the last 2 were going to be leaving the station in the next few days when their parents moved on. On the last day before the trip, Ms. O'Brien gave those 4 the afternoon off. For the remaining students, she had small tricorders that she handed out. These will be very useful to you on the trip, she explained. They've been programmed with all the information that you might need to know about Cetus Beta. I thought we should have a short talk before we leave about what you can expect. Tapping in commands on her computer desk, she called up a projection of a planet. It spun slowly about 4 feet from the ground and was the size of a large beach ball. It was mostly blue, with a lot of green splotches across it. The planet is mostly water, their teacher explained. There are thousands of islands all over the planet, most in long strings or chains. We'll be going to the largest one of these. It lit up a brighter shade of green for them. There are no animals at all on the planet, but there are many, many forms of strange plant life, some of which look a bit like animals at first sight. Are any of them dangerous? Asked Ashley. Only to each other, Ms. O'Brien replied. Some of them are like plant versions of lions and tigers, but they only eat other plants, of course. Since there's never been animal life on the planet, they tend to ignore visitors. Some of them can even move about pretty quickly, which could take some getting used to. I'm more accustomed to plants that stay in one spot. So there's nothing harmful to worry about? Asked Jake. He wondered if that meant the planet might get a bit dull. I didn't say that, their teacher answered, and I don't want you to think it for a moment. Just because nothing will deliberately try to harm you doesn't mean that everything is perfectly safe. For one thing, do not eat any of the plants unless you check with your tricorder first that it isn't poisonous. While nothing on the planet will kill you if you eat it, I can promise you that there are lots of plants that will make you so sick you'll wish you were dying. And then there are some of the very weird plants that you'd better just avoid. She tapped the computer again. Now a new projection appeared next to the spinning planet. It looked like a ball made of grass or rope. This was named a tingle-tangler, she explained. Beside it, a tall, drooping plant appeared. At the end of each frond was a small tingle-tangler. It's one of the attack plants I mentioned earlier. When another plant gets close, she tapped a command on her pad, and one of the small balls fell from the plant. As it did so, it seemed to explode. The larger model tingle-tangler exploded too, shooting out ropes like a net. It wraps up its victim and then gives it a powerful electrical shock. This stuns the plant long enough for the tingle-tangler to eat it. Would we get hurt by one of them? Asked Tara, clearly fascinated. Yes, it wouldn't kill you, but it would be very painful. And, as I say, the plant couldn't eat you, but you would be best to avoid going anywhere too close to one of these bushes. So you all must be careful on Cetus Beta. Yeah, grunted Taryn Bacchus. I sure wouldn't want to have a plant try to eat me, then vomit me out. He shivered. Marn Laren grinned. Bacchus was a bit of a wimp. Sounds like fun to me. Ms. O'Brien nodded. As long as everyone acts sensibly, it should be a lot of fun for us all. Jake was getting really psyched up for the trip now. It did sound interesting, and it would be the first really alien planet he'd ever been on. Even though he'd been down to Bajor a few times and on other planets before he arrived on Deep Space Nine, it all seemed very similar. They're all worlds where humans and other intelligent beings lived, with cities, and most of the wilder spots pretty much tamed. This planet, on the other hand, sounded as if it was really a wild place. Plants that attacked each other, even ran around. This was going to be one neat trip. Excuse me. Back in his room that evening, Jake started packing stuff he'd need for the week. Clothing, of course, and a disc reader with a couple of book cubes, the tricorder he'd just been given, but what else? As he was wondering what he should do, or what he should add to this small pile, his father knocked softly on the door and entered. "How's it going, Jake?" he asked. There was a smile tugging at his lips. "Getting excited about the trip?" "You bet," agreed Jake happily. "This is going to be just terrific. A whole week on an alien planet. Not that I won't miss you, Dad, but..." His father laughed. "I know. I remember the first time I got to camp out on an alien world, too. It's a very special experience, and I know you and your friends are really going to enjoy it. Anyway, since it's your birthday in a few weeks, I thought I'd give you one of your presents early so you could take it along with you on this trip." "Really?" asked Jake. This is getting better and better all the time. "Thanks, Dad." Commander Sisko chuckled and handed over a small silver vid game projector. It was small enough to fit in Jake's lap, with 2 sets of hand controls and a computer pad set into the side. "I had it specially sent in for you," he explained. "It's a baseball program with over 10,000 different plays in its memory." "Hot stuff!" exclaimed Jake with real enthusiasm. Though baseball as a sport had died out a few hundred years earlier, he and his father shared a love of the game. Often they'd go to the holodeck to relive some really special games. Now, thanks to his father, he had a hologame of his own to play with. "In case you get bored in the evenings," his father said. "Now you'll have something to keep you occupied." He showed Jake how to start it up, and a 6-inch high batter appeared, followed by a catcher, a pitcher, and an umpire. "Key in the play you want, and you can take any position you like, and then try the play. The second set of controls is if you want to take on another player. I'm sure you'll get the hang of it pretty fast," and then shut it off. "But no playing with it until you're all packed for the trip." "Okay," agreed Jake happily. He gave his father a hug. "Thanks, Dad. It's the coolest gift." He couldn't help grinning. Boy, is this going to be the best trip ever. The following morning, Jake met up with Nog outside Quark's place. Nog had a backpack slung over his shoulder and a gleam in his eye. Despite his uncle's opinion that vacations were a human invention for wasting time and money, and not the kind of thing Ferengi enjoyed, Nog was obviously looking forward to the trip as much as Jake.
"I've got a dozen expandable sample containers,"
Nog told Jake.
"Uncle Quark gave them to me as a gift and told me to bring back as many samples of the planets as I can."
He rubbed his hands together.
I can almost smell the money we're going to make already. Boy, how much more fun could we have? A trip, time off from school, and a chance to make money. This is living.
They hurried along together to the runabout pad. On the way, Ashley and Tara caught up with them. Both girls wore single-piece coveralls and had their long hair pulled back in braids. Jake supposed it was their idea of how explorers were supposed to dress. Ashley was flushed with excitement. Tara was trying her best to look composed and unemotional about the trip, but there was a gleam in her eye, and she seemed to be almost ready to jump up and down from happiness. The 4 of them compared notes on what they'd packed as they made their way to the pad. There the ship was waiting for them. Its name, the Orinoco, was painted on the prow, and several engineers were performing last-minute checks on it. Ms. O'Brien was there already, checking on supplies were being stowed aboard. Her young daughter Molly was with her, watching everything with her intense stare. As the 4 students approached the ship, the teacher looked around. "You can go aboard now," she told them. "Take your pick of the seats and stow your bags. As soon as I finish up here, we'll be ready to go, okay?" "Sure enough," agreed Jake. He led the others into the runabout through the open door on the side and then looked around. To the left was the prow and the special module insert with the flight seats. There were 20 of these, arranged in pairs on either side of an aisle. To the right was the storage room where the supplies were being loaded. Beyond that must be the engines. Front seats, said Ashley with excitement. She hurried down the aisle and laid claim to one of the seats on the left at the front of the passenger cabin. Tara grabbed the one beside her. Jake and Nog took the 2 seats across the aisle. There were small lockers under the seats for their bags, which they immediately stowed away. There was a row of windows down the side of the craft through which they could see the activity in the launch bay. The flight deck was directly in front of them, with 3 seats set in front of the flight computers. Only one of these was occupied. Obviously, this was a person who was to be their pilot and the only other adult along on the trip. Hearing the sounds of movement behind him, the man twisted in his seat to look back. He was a tall man, wearing the pips on his collar to show he was a Starfleet lieutenant. He had a mess of straw-colored hair and a thin, somewhat nervous face. "Keep it down back there, okay?" he called. "I'd appreciate it." Jake shrugged. "Okay," he agreed. Not that they had been noisy anyway, but it was better not to argue. "Fine." The lieutenant turned back to his checks, but Jake distinctly heard him mutter, "Children should be seen and not heard." Ashley had obviously heard it too, because she stuck out her tongue at the man's back. "Children," she said softly. She made it sound as if she were cursing. "I don't think we're going to get along too well with this guy." Jake tried to pretend he wasn't bothered, but he didn't like being called a child either. Still, this trip was too important to start it by arguing with her pilot. Instead, Jake peered through the small window beside his seat. "Here come the others," he said. Marn Laren led her little group of Bajorans into the craft. She looked a little annoyed that the 4 friends had already claimed the front seats. However, she was too excited by the thought of the trip to kick up a fuss, and she soon had the 6 of them installed in the next 2 rows. The other Bajorans looked eager, except for Terran Bacchus. Nervous as ever, he was almost shaking. "I don't want to go," he muttered. "Show some spirit," Laren told him, annoyed. "We're Bajorans. Nothing scares us." "I gotta go to the bathroom," Bacchus answered, and rushed to the back of the craft. Laren sighed. Their pilot glanced back as the Bajorans were stowing their packs and chattering happily. "Keep it down," he called. "Trying to work up here, okay?" Laren scowled back at him. "We're doing our best," she snapped. "Give us a break, will you?" Before the pilot could reply, Ms. O'Brien entered the shuttle carrying Molly. Both of them were grinning. "Everybody happy?" she asked. "Not everybody," Tara said with blunt honesty. She glanced at the pilot. Ms. O'Brien placed Molly in one of the seats. It was still empty, and then looked at the pilot. "Is something wrong, Lieutenant Danvers?" she asked mildly. The pilot thought for a moment and then shook his head. "Just kids," he said. "They're kind of noisy for my liking." "Well," Ms. O'Brien replied, "I'm afraid you'll have to get used to slightly increased noise levels for the next week. Believe me, it is possible to adjust. I had to." "If you say so," Lieutenant Danvers said politely. He gestured to his panel. "Well, ma'am, we appear to be about ready. Everything looks good from here, and the stores are all stowed." "Marvelous," the teacher answered. She took one of the 2 free seats beside the pilot as Bacchus returned to his seat. "Shall we get underway?" "Okay," he agreed. He tapped in several quick commands. Jake heard the outer door hiss closed and the seal snap on. The interior lighting of the shuttle brightened slightly. The pilot said, "Life support all green, internal gravity normal, power levels full." He tapped his communicator badge. "Orinoco to ops, awaiting clearance." "Ops to runabout Orinoco," came Commander Sisko's voice from the air. "You're cleared to leave." There was the slightest pause, and then, "Have a great time. That's an order. Sisko out." Jake leaned forward in his seat, staring through the transparent window at the front of the craft. There was a soft whine conducted through the floor, and he could see that the ship was rising. The gravity inside the ship was kept constant, so there was no sensation of movement at all. But Jake knew that the airlock overhead must have slid open, and the ram below the runabout was pushing the craft upward. Then the stars appeared as it cleared the upper deck of the station. The younger Bajorans all gasped and laughed at the sight of the millions of stars burning brightly in the sky. The bulk of the station was below them and one of the pylons ahead and to the right. A light blinked on and off atop it. "Here we go," said Lieutenant Danvers. At his gentle touch, the runabout's engines whined slightly more loudly, and the ship rose from the docking ram and into free space. Their field trip had begun.
Ch.3&4.
Jake pressed his face against the window beside him, determined not to miss anything that happened. He did steal one quick glance about the cabin, though, to make sure he wasn't the only one acting so excitedly. To his relief, everyone else was staring avidly out the windows closest to them. Even Nog was crowding him a bit in order to get the best view. So far, they'd seen nothing that couldn't be witnessed every day from the station itself. However, Jake knew that in a few moments, that would all change. They were approaching the wormhole. Normally, the wormhole was invisible. This was how it had remained undiscovered for so long, until Jake's father had made the first trip into it over 2 years earlier. Now that its position was known precisely, the runabout could take the same approach path that would trigger the visual outpouring of the wormhole. "Here we go," called Miss O'Brien from her seat. She sounded almost as excited as Jake felt. He glanced across the cabin and saw the stars through the large front window suddenly explode in a barrage of light. The wormhole was like a huge whirlpool of all imaginable colors, swirling and glowing in space right in front of the runabout. Several of the students gave gasps of delight, and Molly cried, "Pretty!" Jake couldn't blame her. It was the most beautiful sight imaginable. And then the small craft flew into the mouth of the wormhole, and the stars vanished completely. All about the ship was a solid mass of colors: reds, blues, greens, yellows, purples, and all shades and combinations. It was as if someone had taken millions of shades of all the colors of the spectrum and then whipped them all together and threw the resulting mess onto the wall of a giant spinning tunnel. Lights within the wall glowed and skipped, highlighting portions of the swirling complex of colors. It was an unimaginable result, and Jake stared at it in awe. He knew that the colors were a product of the warped space and the particles of light that traveled through the wormhole, but it's just facts. The brilliant, almost hypnotic whirlpool of colors was simply beautiful. He also knew that this wormhole was artificial. It had been created by a species of alien beings that lived outside of time itself. They allowed other species to use it, but they very rarely contacted anyone who traveled this path. The runabout plowed onward. It looked as if Lieutenant Danvers was threading them down a long and winding pathway that ran through the tunnel of color, but Jake knew that they were actually being pulled along by the wormhole itself, which was tugging them through to its far end. The trip seemed to take forever, but actually lasted only about 5 minutes. But what 5 minutes! It was just incredible staring out at the tunnel. Then they were through it, and the stars suddenly reappeared about them. Molly said, "Ah!" and the other students all sighed. Jake was a little disappointed, but also a little relieved. Staring so long at the swirling colors, it started his head spinning, too. He caught one last glimpse of the whirlpool of light, and the wormhole closed behind them, and they were in the Gamma Quadrant at last. "Oh, wow," he breathed, settling back into his seat. "That was some trip." Nog sat down properly and wrinkled his nose.
It was okay, I guess,
he said, obviously trying not to sound too impressed. "Okay?" asked Ashley. "It was awesome, right, Tara?" The young Vulcan girl nodded solemnly. "Most enlightening." Jake wondered if that was her idea of a pun, but knew that even if it was, she'd never admit to having a sense of humor. "I feel sick," said Bacchus from behind them. "Oh, grow up," snapped Laren. Ms. O'Brien came back to join them. "The rest of the journey is going to take us about 3 hours at warp speed," she said. "So don't get too impatient." She glanced back over her shoulder in the direction of the pilot. "Or too noisy, okay? Maybe you should all take the chance to go over the notes in your tricorders about Cetus Beta, so you'll know some more about it by the time we arrive." Jake wished he could play with his vid game instead, but he knew a gentle order when he heard one. They might be off school for the next week, but that didn't mean that they weren't going to have to do some studying, obviously. "There we are," announced Lieutenant Danvers finally. He gestured ahead of the small craft. at the planet hanging in the blackness of space. It looked to Jake almost identical to the hologram that he'd seen in class, a globe slowly moving, mostly blue with blotches of green that were islands. The only difference was that this real world had trails of clouds across it. "Okay, kids, get back in your seats," the lieutenant added. "This should be a real smooth landing, but let's not chance any broken bones, okay?" Jake felt the slight tug of the force field that held him in his seat. He knew that the internal gravity field of the runabout should make it simple to land, but their pilot was probably right to take no chances. If they ran into a storm, things could get bumpy. "Isn't this great?" he asked Nog excitedly. The Ferengi shrugged, again pretending he wasn't impressed.
I guess so.
"I think it's really neat," Ashley commented. "This is going to be the first alien world I've ever been on, except for Bajor. I can hardly wait to go exploring." "Yeah," agreed Bren Sainer, who was sitting behind her. "And Bajor isn't alien. It's home." "Maybe for you," Ashley said with a laugh. The globe ahead of them had grown in size as they approached it, and now overflowed the windows. Lieutenant Danvers was bringing the runabout easily down toward the world. Through the large window, Jake could see nothing now but ocean and the scattered strings of islands. One of them was their target, and they'd be down in a few minutes. "That's odd," muttered the pilot suddenly. He glanced at Ms. O'Brien. "I'm getting a lot of static on the sensors." "Trouble?" she asked, worried. "I don't think so," he replied. "It won't affect our landing, but these readings are very odd. It's like there's..." He broke off. "There's another ship coming up from the planet." "There isn't supposed to be anybody else here," the teacher replied. "I checked. So what are they doing?" She leaned over the sensor computer and started to scan the readings. "Do we have an identification yet?" "No, the interference is making it... It's a Cardassian raider." Jake and the rest couldn't help hearing all of this conversation. He suddenly felt sick. While the Cardassians were supposed to be at peace with the Federation, they could get nasty at times. They were a very aggressive species, and the military ruled their worlds. These soldiers didn't care much for the uneasy peace with the Federation and often strained it to almost the breaking point. If the Cardassians were here on Cetus Beta for some unexplained reason, then they wouldn't be likely to want any members of the Federation around. "Oh, great," he muttered. "Maybe they've decided to claim this planet and want us to go home. That could ruin the trip."
"And our hopes of making money,"
agreed Nog with a groan. In the cabin, Ms. O'Brien glanced quickly back at her students. "Maybe we should call for help?" she suggested softly. "Can't at the moment," Lieutenant Danvers replied. "Static's too strong. Still, I don't think that even the Cardassians would try and cause trouble. Would they?" "I'll try hailing them and see what they want," Ms. O'Brien said. "It's probably nothing serious." She reached toward the communicator panel, but she didn't get a chance even to try. There was a bright flash directly in front of the craft, and the runabout gave a series of shudders. Several of the younger Bajorans screamed, and Jake was blinded for a second. "They're firing on us!" the pilot cried, astounded. "The dirty little..." His fingers flew across the controls as he tried to regain level heading once more. The seat's force field held Jake firmly in place. Otherwise, he'd have been thrown across the cabin. A couple of tricorders and several smaller items were slamming back and forth. Bacchus was screaming, and Molly had begun to howl in response. There was nothing he could do to help them, since he could barely shift in his seat. A second soundless blast shook the runabout. And this time there was a smell of burning from the rear of the cabin. Jake managed to look over his shoulder and saw sparks flying out of the supply area. "We've been hit!" Lieutenant Danvers yelled. "How badly?" asked Ms. O'Brien, her face pale. "Hard to say," the pilot answered tightly. He was struggling with the controls as the runabout shook from side to side. "I'm going to try for a landing. We're still on course for that large island, at least." Jake wished there was something he could do. Even if the force field wasn't holding him in place, though, he knew that he'd only get in the way. On the other hand, he might be able to comfort some of the younger kids. Bacchus was still screaming in fear, and now Chel Boras and Pat Kalin had joined in. Molly was crying and shaking. Jake reached back and held her hand.
"I'm gonna die,"
muttered Nog.
"Worse, I'm gonna die poor."
There was a screaming noise from outside the runabout, and the craft shuddered. For a second, Jake thought they'd been hit again. But then he realized it was because the ship had entered the planet's atmosphere and there was air outside to conduct sound and create turbulence. "Hang on!" yelled Lieutenant Danvers. "This is gonna be a really bumpy landing, I'm afraid." Jake could see the planet below filling the forward window now. They seemed to be heading down toward it awfully fast. From the side window, he could see a trail of smoke. Something had to be burning or venting outside the craft. He could only hope it was nothing essential, like the braking thrusters. His heart was racing, and in the back of his mind was the knowledge that they might not survive the landing attempt. Then the island filled the forward view. It was huge and absolutely covered with plants, trees, other greenery. Cliffs loomed ahead of them, but somehow the pilot brought the nose of the runabout up, and they avoided smashing into the cliff face. Huge towers of rocks whipped past the small ship, and below them was a tangle of jungle. Lieutenant Danvers was hitting the control panels to try and get responses. Several of them had small fires that Ms. O'Brien was trying to put out with a foam extinguisher. Then, finally, the braking jets kicked in. If it hadn't been for the gravity field holding up, Jake and the others would have been slammed into their seats with enough force to break their spines. As it was, he was still shaken by the sudden loss of forward motion. There was the unmistakable sound of another explosion outside the ship. A huge chunk of the exterior peeled away from the craft, scratched along the window beside Jake, and then plunged to the ground below. A fireball belched out from the side of the ship. "Losing power!" the pilot called. "We're going in!" The runabout lurched again, and the nose dropped. Jake almost lost his breakfast. The craft plunged down toward the tangled greenery below. Nog was shaking in fear, his face buried in his arms, but Jake couldn't look away. The trees were suddenly right in front of the ship. Metal screamed and tore, branches were ripped free and pulped. The runabout shook like one of the millions of leaves that were flying from the impact. One window toward the back of the craft shattered, showering transparent aluminum into the runabout. There were further explosions from the back of the ship, and then the artificial gravity field died. Jake's stomach wrenched as the planet's gravity took over. The craft slammed hard against a huge tree that had to be almost 50 feet across its trunk. The collision shattered the front window and ripped a huge tear in the trunk. Jake was hammered in his seat by the force of the impact, and he almost blacked out. He heard Lieutenant Danvers give a scream of pain. "Ah!" And then the runabout fell heavily the final few feet to the ground.